What's up, everybody? Nick O'Dwyer back for the 10th inning. In yesterday's episode, we saw Cal Ripken Jr. become only the second player in MLB history to reach 2,000 consecutive games played. We don't have any milestones like that today, but we do have some more Olympics to talk about. We have an MLB Hall of Famer making their debut, and we have some more MLB Hall of Fame inductions to get into. So if y'all enjoy this video, leave a like on it. If you're new to the channel, like what you see, hit that subscribe button. Before we get into this, I just want to reiterate a point that I did make in yesterday's episode. There are so many Olympic Games that will be going on in these next couple of days, weeks, that it's really just impossible for me to mention everything. If I did, this could be a 50-minute video. I don't want to make it that. I want to make it somewhat enjoyable for you guys, so I am cutting it down to what I feel is very important, and if I'm missing something, I apologize. But now that that's out of the way, let's get to it. This day in sports history. We start out with the MLB debut very early on today in 1907. Walter Johnson, at only 19 years old, would begin his 21-year career with the Washington Senators going up against the Detroit Tigers. Johnson would end up getting the loss in his debut in a 3-2 loss against the Tigers. But it's not like he pitched poorly. 8 innings pitched, 6 hits allowed, 2 runs, 1 walk, 3 strikeouts. Ironically, the first hit he did give up was to a fellow Hall of Famer, Ty Cobb. We now move to golf in 1912 at the US Open. John McDermott, with a score of 2 under, would successfully defend his title 2 strokes ahead of Tom McNamara. This would be his second straight US Open title and his final of 2 majors. 7 years later in 1919, Fred Ladouris would play in his 479th straight contest since June 2nd, 1916, breaking Eddie Collins' consecutive games record. He would extend his major league mark to 533 before the streak would end at the start of the 1920 season. I mean, compared to Garrett, compared to Ripken, those seem small, but it's still an impressive feat. 2 years later, we move up to 1921, and I'm sure everybody has heard of the Black Sox scandal, but we're talking about that right now. 8 Black Sox players would be acquitted by a jury that they conspired to defraud the public through throwing of the 1919 World Series. This would be a little bit of a victory for them, but again, if you know the Black Sox scandal, you know it wasn't a victory in the end. 15 years later, we move up to 1936, and we start at the Tour de France, and Sévère Mize would win his first of 2 titles. Then we go to the Olympics in 1936. We start with a Finnish trifecta at the 10,000 meter final when Ilmari Salminen would win with a time of 30 minutes, 15.4 seconds, defeating teammates Arvo Ascola, who would finish only 0.2 seconds behind him, and Valmari Isoholo. Then we move to the high jump in 36. And just like it was a Finnish trifecta for the 10,000 meters, this would be an American trifecta in the high jump, when Cornelius Johnson would win at 2.03 meters, then Dave Albritton at 2 meters, and Delos Thurber at 2 meters would get silver and bronze, sweeping the high jump medals. 2 years later in 1938, in Major League Baseball, there was a bit of an experiment going on. The MLB conducted the first test of bright yellow baseballs during the Dodgers-Cardinals doubleheader. They only did it for 1 game though. Now it is worth noting that people did not necessarily have a problem with it, but it was only there for a few appearances because both managers had to agree on that. There were a lot of logistics going on with it, but in the end, it's safe to say the little experiment didn't work out. We go back to the Olympics now in 1948, and we start in the women's 100-meter dash, and Fanny Blankers-Keon of the Netherlands would win the 100 meters in 11.9 seconds to win the first of 3 individual track and field gold medals at the Games and 4 overall gold medals. Then in the women's 100-meter freestyle, Danish swimmer Greta Anderson, with a time of 1 minute 6.3 seconds, would outtouch American Ann Curtis by 0.2 seconds to win the gold medal. Then in the men's discus final, Italians Adolfo Consolini with an Olympic record of 52.78 and Giuseppe Tosi with 51.78 meters would go 1 and 2 in the discus final. 4 years later, we move up to the Helsinki Olympics, and we start in boxing when 17-year-old future world champion Floyd Patterson would win the gold medal in the middleweight division after a first-round knockout of Vasily Tita. 7 years later, we go to the PGA Championship in 1959, and Bob Rosberg, with a score of 3 under, would win one stroke ahead of Jerry Barber and Doug Sanders to win his only major. Also in 1959, future Hall of Fame first baseman Willie McCovey would hit his first of 521 MLB home runs in a 5-3 victory over the Pirates. 9 years later, in 1968, we have a bit of an interesting one right here. Ron Hansen for Washington and Tim Cullen for the White Sox would become the first MLB players to be traded for each other twice in the same season. They had been traded in February in opposite directions, and now they got traded back. This would be the only time in MLB history that this occurrence would happen. 5 years later, in 1973, we stick with Major League Baseball, and Mets outfielder Cleon Jones would become the first player in franchise history to collect 1,000 base hits, after a double in a 5-1 victory over the Pirates. 7 years later, we move to 1980 at the Olympics, and Cuban super heavyweight Teofilo Stevenson would become the first fighter to win 3 Olympic gold medals in the same division, 72, 76, now 80. He would do this after scoring a 4-1 point decision over Petar Zayev of the Soviet Union. 1 year later, in 1981, we have some MLB Hall of Fame inductions to talk about, when Bob Gibson would be voted in by the BBWAA, and then Johnny Mize, who played for the Cardinals, Giants, and Yankees, and Negro League pioneer Rube Foster would be inducted into the Hall of Fame by the Veterans Committee. 1 year later, in 1982, in Major League Baseball, Oakland Athletics outfielder Rickey Henderson would steal his 100th MLB base of the season in a 6-5 win over Seattle for the second time in the modern era, making him the first to steal 100 times in the modern era. He would do that one more time in his career. We move up to 1984 now, and we get into some Greco-Roman wrestling at the Olympics, and Jeff Blatnick would become the first American to win a gold medal in Greco-Roman in the 100 plus kilogram division, and he would be the first of 2 Americans to win the gold medal at that Olympics in Greco-Roman. 2 years later, in 1986, we have a world record from one of the greatest heptathlon athletes ever, in Jackie Joyner-Kersee, beating her own record by 13 points to get 7,161 points. She would go on to beat it 2 more times. Staying in 1986, at the Curtis Cup on the women's side, Great Britain and Ireland would defeat the USA 13-5. This would be Great Britain and Ireland's first ever victory on American soil and their third of 8 overall victories. 1 year later, in 1987, at the Fed Cup, Steffi Graf and Claudia Kohl-Kielsch would defeat Chris Evert and Pam Shriver in the doubles, as Germany would defeat the USA 2-1 to claim their first of 2 titles. We move back to Major League Baseball now in 1987, and Cincinnati Reds outfielder Eric Davis would become only the 7th player at that time to have a 30-30 season, 30 home runs, 30 stolen bases, as he would homer in a Reds 5-4 victory over the Giants. Joe Carter would actually also do it that season. 5 years later, we start with the MLB Hall of Fame induction ceremony, and Tom Seaver, with a 98.8%, and Raleigh Fingers would be voted in by the BBWAA, and they would be joined by Hal Newhouser and Bill McGowan, inducted into Cooperstown. Then in the Barcelona Olympics, we go right back to her. Jackie Joyner-Kersee would become the first athlete to win consecutive gold medals in the heptathlon after a 199 point over Irina Belova of the Soviet Union. Joyner would win this with 7,044 points. Then in gymnastics, Vitaly Sherbo of Belarus would become the first gymnast to win 6 gold medals at one Olympics, also becoming the first to win 4 gold in one day's competition when he would win the pommel, the vault, the rings, and the parallel bars. He would also win the all-around individual and team. 1 year later, we have a buying of a Major League Baseball team when Maryland investors, led by Baltimore attorney Peter Angelos, would buy the Baltimore Orioles for $173 million, nearly $50 million more than ever paid for a baseball team at the time. 3 years later, we go back to the Olympics in 1996, and the star-studded United States men's basketball team, or the Dream Team 3 as some people like to claim, would defeat Yugoslavia 95-69 to win the gold medal. In the tournament, USA went 5-0 with a point differential of plus 177. 2 years later, we go to the Canadian Open on the women's side in 1998, and Brandy Burton, with a score of 18 under, would win 1 stroke ahead of runner-up Annika Sorenstam to win her second of 2 majors. Then at the Curtis Cup in 98, the US would defeat Great Britain and Ireland 10-8 to claim their 21st of 29 victories. Finally in 98 at the Tour de France, Marco Pantani would win his only tour. 7 years later, we moved to the NBA, and the largest trade in NBA history would occur as 5 teams would combine to swap 13 players. This deal would bring Antoine Walker and Jason Williams to the Miami Heat, and next season, the Miami Heat would win their first ever championship. 4 years later, in 2009, Michael Phelps would end the World Swimming Championship in Rome with his 5th gold medal as part of the US 4x100 medley relay. We stay in 2009 at the British Open on the women's side, and Katrina Matthew, with a score of 3 under, would win her only major title, 3 strokes ahead of runner-up Carrie Webb. 2 years later in Major League Baseball, in 2011, Mark Teixeira would hit home runs from both sides of the plate for the 12th time in his career, setting a new Major League record, passing Eddie Murray and Shilly Davis, who both did this 11 times during their careers. Teixeira would go on to do this 3 more times in his career for an all-time lead at 15. 1 year later, we go back to Michael Phelps, this time in the London Olympics in 2012. Phelps would win his 3rd consecutive gold medal in the 200-meter individual medley at 1 minute 54.27 seconds, just adding to his record of medals, and he would win this 0.63 seconds ahead of Ryan Lochte. Then in the women's 200-meter breaststroke in 2012, American Rebecca Soni would become the first woman to win the breaststroke twice with a world record of 2 minutes 19.59 seconds. It would be broken a year later. 2 years later in 2014, we go to the Super Rugby final, and the New South Wales Waratahs would win their first Super Rugby title after a 33-32 victory over the Canterbury Crusaders. We end today's video off in 2015 at the British Open on the women's side, and Imbi Park, with a score of 12 under, would shoot a final round 65, 7 under, 3 strokes ahead of Jin Young Ko to win her 7th and final major as of now. So there you have it. That's what happened on this day in sports history. If I left anything out, I do apologize. If I mispronounced any names, I also apologize. But I'll see everybody tomorrow for Nick O'Dwyer and the 10th inning. See ya.